Look like it'll just be us two.
It's that way.
Eric already said he wouldn't be able to make it in the Gitter.
Yeah, I haven't caught up with the Gitter yet. Let's see. Okay. Right. Okay. What is PTO?
Paid time off.
Okay. This an Americanism?
I'm not sure. My old company changed vacation to something like that as well, with the implication that if you're taking time off, it shouldn't be applied that like it's a leisurely vacation, because it could be for other reasons. It could be much less positive things like bereavement or whatever. So they just removed the concept of calling it vacation in general, which seemed reasonable. So you don't make assumptions that if someone's gone for a week, it's because it was something happy happened.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
Not bad. I think it's probably just us.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, I'm hanging out with two kittens in my room, so
Cool.
I will show them to you, and then I will probably go videoless for the rest of the meeting. Say hi.
Are they new additions?
They are new additions.
It's pretty cool.
What kind of cats are they?
They're Abyssinians. Like I don't know. They're supposed to be kind of like the original Egyptian cat. Yeah, this cat in my picture is Cosmo. He was my first Abby. He lived to be 18 years old, but he kind of passed away this summer. So these guys are the next generation.
I know someone who has those hairless cats. And I always I'm not much for like cats just because I never grew up with them, and I always thought they were kind of weird looking. But when you're around them in person, they're not that weird. Surprisingly, they're kind of fuzzy and they act like nimble dogs. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, I've seen the Sphinxes. Those are the hairless ones. They're interesting. Like, I think the Abyssinian has like a similar body type, but it actually has fur.
Yeah.
Kind of like a shorter fur. Yeah, let me go ahead. Let's see if I can get a screen share going.
Just before we get started, we can do that in the latter half, but I want to make sure we carve out a little bit of time just to go over the Kafka PR. There's some comments that I left unaddressed, but I think we should just probably talk over it in person, and then I can leave comments after the fact for posterity.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think the spec sig should be pretty quick, and stop me if it's not. Yeah, there was just kind of a very long discussion around versioning and stability with no real resolution about mainly kind of, it's pretty clear when something has changed or been broken in like the API or the SDK, but it becomes like a little bit more nebulous, I think, when it comes to like instrumentation. And like, I think there's a lot of discussion about like, is adding an attribute something that is actually okay, or is this going to break backends? And I think coming from the tracing perspective, that stuff should totally be fine. But I think the thing going through some people's minds is metrics, where adding like a label actually kind of changes the metric technically. I think it maybe depends on your back end, but kind of, you know, in most cases, I believe like a metric should be identified by the set of labels on it. So by like adding a label, you have now kind of created a new time series. And depending on what sort of filtering rules you have or alerting rules you have, that might not work out super well with your backend. Does that not match your understanding, Francis? I know it seems like you.
I mean, I'm just thinking about how we do metrics. We're using StatsD or Dog StatsD actually, and I think adding labels generally doesn't break anything. Removing labels certainly will break things. But yeah, if you add a label and it's not actually used anywhere, then it's effectively going to be ignored when people are, like, the label itself will be ignored. The metric value will still be valid with all the other labels that it has. I don't know of metric backends where this would break things. I can see that it would create a new kind of metric set, like a new time series basically. And that could be problematic as a performance concern, but I'd be surprised if it was problematic in a as a correctness thing or a compatibility thing.
Yeah, I think ultimately the resolution that we did come to is that there needs to be some kind of rules for what can change, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, I don't know, I think there was some kind of discussion where like they don't have to fit a vendor's schemes today, but whatever the rules are, they need to be reasonable, and some people may need to adapt to the rules depending on how they shake out. But yeah, I think that was like the core thing. It's just like, how mainly do we communicate changes to the telemetry data kind of coming out of the SDKs, and it's more for the benefit of like the tracing backend to make sure that things that it relies on will not kind of disappear, mainly disappear and break things, because I think a lot of people have like dashboards and alerts on some of this data, and you don't want to just kind of have to remake those or babysit those every time you kind of upgrade. It's like you need to have a way to know, going in to an upgrade, that things could change. So yeah, I think there will be some more discussions around that, but that took up a lot of the meeting. And then the thing that took pretty much the rest of the meeting was this discussion about how to make service name mandatory or not in the resource. And I think we would like to make sure that there is a service name attribute in the resource somewhere. And it seems like this has been proposed, and there has been some like iteration on the spec, and all of the things that they are doing just seems crazy to me. In terms of how they're trying to ensure that there's a fallback for resource or for service name in the resource. Like, I really think, I think the way it works in Ruby and the way it should probably work everywhere is that you just should have this like default resource that has like some required attributes with some default values, and then whatever the user wants, you just merge on top of that. And if they provided something, it will wipe out whatever default you had set. But that would be the way to achieve this. But I think the problem is that different people have approaches from different angles, and I think we're kind of approaching it from the angle of like, you kind of have this default resource, probably, I would have to look back at the code, but when you initialize a tracer provider, and I think we merge everything on top of that, I think there was some desire for some of the people involved in this conversation to be able to like say, no, we don't actually care about any of the default attributes. We would like to be able to provide an empty resource, and that should really, you know, take precedence. I'm less sure that that is really like a valid use case, but there was a lot of talk about this. I think I'm not sure what the end result is. There was going to be a write-up of options, I think, on 1294, but I think as they were kind of discussing the end, they were saying that kind of the main reason for all of this is due to this 1237, that the Jaeger exporter requires a service name, and they just wanted to make sure that it would come from that it would be available in the resource, more or less. So I don't know, do I have this right? Do we always have kind of like we always construct some sort of like base default resource in the tracer provider, and then whatever the user provides, we merge with that resource?
We do the merging. I don't know whether we start with an empty one or not. I'm just going to check that.
In the configurator, we start with like a default resource that isn't empty. It contains like the telemetry SDK resource name, language, and version. So it's like OpenTelemetry, Ruby, and the version of the SDK. And so it creates that, like in the configurator, it starts with that by default, and then you can merge anything you want on top of that.
Yeah, and I thought, you know, when we had this, I thought when we added this, there was a thing in the spec, at least at that point in time, that said that there had to be a telemetry SDK resource. It was required.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's required,
That doesn't satisfy the service name thing, though.
yeah, but I was thinking that service name could also be required somewhere, potentially.
Like if it comes out that it is required, that one is set by default, like it doesn't seem unreasonable that we just create in that resource in that default when we set a service name to something generic like unknown, and then we still keep our exposing like the service name in the configurator, and that would just override it. So by default, you're unknown, and we provide an easy way to supply a proper name.
So everything here seems to say non-required, but I feel like this is probably a change that happened somewhere over time. I would recommend that this be required. Am I crazy to think that this was required at one point?
I feel like it was, because I made the change because I think it was explicitly required. Or at least someone said it was required, and I
Well, so
took it at face value.
there's some weirdness in there about whether you're the default SDK or not, right?
Must set telemetry SDK name to the value.
Right. So there's a thing saying that about the service name, there's so that one's required. So there's a weirdness because it says, the table says the telemetry SDK name is not required, but then the text says that it must be set to the value of OpenTelemetry. So
Yeah, and it seems like it says that for either the default or another one. So at any rate, like,
yeah, the language also says it's not required, like SDK language, but then the subsequent text says it must be one of these or a custom value. So
yeah, so this is riddled with inconsistencies,
yeah.
but it's definitely not. Yeah, it doesn't seem to indicate that this is like a hard requirement, at least not in the same way that it was before. I don't know if that's intentional or not. So I don't know. I'll take a closer look at the discussion on this issue. It sounds like it's already a can of worms, but
yeah, there's a whole bunch, like there's a paragraph near the top of document conventions that is incredibly wishy-washy, right? It's just like certain attribute groups in this document have a required column for these groups. If any attribute from the particular group is present in the resource, then all attributes marked as required must also be present. However, it's valid if the entire attribute group is omitted, even if some are marked as required. So just because it says it's required doesn't mean it's required.
Always things like that always make me think. I don't know if either of you have ever watched much Simpsons in your life, but there's an episode where Bart wants to get a pocket knife and they give him a manual and it says, "Don't do what Donnie Don't does." And it just shows the kid doing horrible things with the pocket knife. And Bart's sitting there looking so confused.
yeah. So I feel like there should be a default resource for the telemetry SDK, to be honest, that just identifies what is the thing reporting. I feel like every backend wants this. I don't know of any backend that doesn't want to know where the data is coming from. And that would make all this like super simple if we just said you need to have a service name, it needs to identify the language and version of the SDK, and be done with it. And then if you want to change that, you can change it, but like at a minimum out of the box, it's going to kind of report what it is. But yeah, I don't know. I guess as I say that, like one of the things that people probably are going to want is just like minimizing the amount of resource data that you need to send with everything. But I kind of feel like the proto takes care of this. I don't know. We've probably talked about this enough, though. I don't know if there's anything more we should say about it. We can, but at least the consensus for now is that everything is a can of worms. There was going to be some proposals updated here. I don't know if there's any like ramifications for how we're currently doing things and how things are currently spec'd.
They have an open issue for the fallback case for a service name because that was previously merged into the spec.
All right. Yeah. So at any rate, I guess we should just kind of keep an eye on this and I don't know, see if what we're currently doing is a valid and reasonable use case. I would have to check, but I think JavaScript is doing the same thing, and I think for the most part, like, I'm just thinking about like light stuff. I think it would be a problem for us if the SDKs did not report like what language and version they were. Like, I think we also kind of rely on that. And I can't imagine that any backend would just not want that information. So,
Right. Yeah. The interesting thing for like Go provides a bunch of default detectors, but the resource detection mechanism has options to say, like, turn off the defaults. So I think conceivably you can force it to give you an empty resource, which is a little weird.
yeah. Yeah, I guess I don't fully understand like the empty resource case. Like on one hand, like in theory, I understand like the desire to be able to like have an empty thing, just because like it's useful in theory if you know wanted nothing or just wanted to build something up from scratch. But in practice, I do think there's like a minimum set of like data that everybody's probably actually going to want. And if we can agree on that, then just kind of having like a default resource that has that would like really simplify everything here. Because I just feel like everything with resources becomes like a huge can of worms when you start to factor in that like you can have a bunch of detectors, they can run asynchronously, they can fail, and like it has a lot of implications for trying to resolve those at export time, and what happens in the multitude of edge cases that can show up in that whole process. So I know, yeah, I think we could talk about this more, but we can totally move on if we've covered things sufficiently. What do you all think?
I think we can move on. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to get engaged in the can of worms. I just want to know how it gets resolved so we can implement it and move on.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I might try to like spelunk the history on that file and see if that telemetry, if there was ever like some stronger language saying that was required. And if so, I might just bring that up and say that I think that's a really good idea. And what if we also just made service name also something that is required and has a fallback, so that without user intervention, like you will have like this bare minimum resource that we always have. Yeah. And I feel like for like the, yeah, I will not complete that thought. I was going to say, if you had some really weird, maybe I will complete it. If you had some really weird use cases where you wanted to remove some of these labels, I feel like you could achieve that somehow in a span processor or something along those lines. The end. And I ducked out for the last 10 minutes. So it was the issue triage. I don't totally know what happened, but I think that probably not much. And I guess the only other thing, you all probably got a notification yesterday that we're canceling next week's meeting. If not, next week's SIG meeting is canceled. We were kind of at the maintainers meeting yesterday, like everybody was canceling that week for the most part. So if you want to hold the meeting, we could probably uncancel it, but that's kind of the current status.
I'm out for the next, like after this week, I'm out for the next 2 weeks, so.
Yeah, I figured most people are. So shall we move on to our repo?
Sure.
And is GraphQL the
The Kafka one, I think, would be.
Yeah, sorry. That's what I had in my mind, but I did not say.
So there's 2 points, I guess, to like bring up, and also one of your comments, or yeah, one of your comments I left unanswered because I kind of thought about it a bit, and it was regarding the use or lack of use of active support notifications, like hooking on the start and end. I hated that I didn't document it because I don't remember exactly what the reason was for now, but in the producer and consumer, or specifically in the consumer, I was running into an issue with the active support notification. So doing the patch seemed more reliable, more predictable. But just to like touch on the point of like all the active support notifications that we have right now, Francis and I were talking about it and considering the idea of dropping all those extra notifications because they're not in the spec, and it's not totally clear like if we need them, and it might make more sense to put that off to like a follow-up PR so that this can kind of make a little bit of progress. So that was like, I guess, like the first point, to see what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, so are you saying that we're actually generating more spans than possibly necessary according to the messaging spec?
Yeah, so these are the things like any of the things like in the events folder I have, like sync group, leave group, join group, heartbeat. Don't believe those are actually specified in the spec. That was more or less just a copy of what Datadog had. Because that was my starting point, as I tried to copy Datadog as closely as possible. But like I don't have a strong opinion on these things. Like I don't know what value they provide to someone who's instrumenting Kafka. Like I don't know how much someone cares about it. But more importantly, like I'm coming from the angle that I'd like to kind of unblock this PR a little bit. So it's like, it's not saying no to these things. It's just maybe no right now. We can like push them off a bit, and that could be a separate PR that can have its own conversation around these spans, or whether or not they should even be spans, or maybe they should be events, as Francis has suggested, that like they could be events. So that's just in regard to anything in the like the events folder there.
Yeah, if all right, so a couple things. If these are blocking this PR, we can definitely get rid of them. If they're not so much like a problem, then I'm okay either way. I don't have strong opinions as to whether they should stay or not. I don't know if Eric would, but I think, you know, from what I know, you know, the produce and consumes are kind of like the things that most people are going to be worried about. And I feel like a minimum viable Kafka would kind of cover those at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In my experience, produce and consumes are the things that are important. All these events, like in our instrumentation at Shopify, we have not instrumented any of these events. A bunch of these events are just events. They're not, or like they're just a notification. There's no block associated with it. So it really is just a timestamp. It's not a duration. So we kind of need to go through them one by one and say, is this something that makes sense as a span, or does it make sense as an event? Some of these things are also triggered outside of the context of produce and consume. So it's not really clear what they represent, or what the parent span would be, or what the span would be if they're treated as an event. So I feel like we need to do a lot more detailed digging before we commit to something here, which is why I was suggesting maybe we can just yank them out of this PR and have a follow-up PR where we address them, possibly with input, certainly with input from Eric about how Datadog uses these things, whether they require them to be spans, whether they can handle them as events, whether they have customers that are depending on them, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that sounds good. So one of the things you mentioned is that these don't have a duration associated. They just kind of have a timestamp. Is that all right? So that sounds like the definition of event. But I think
not all of them though. Like some are blocks, but some are not. So
yeah, for the ones that are timestamps, like I think the one problem with having them be an event is there does need to really be like kind of a current span for you to have an event to add it to. So yeah, I think we would have to like make sure that there is like, however the instrumentation falls out, that there would be some sort of current span that was hopefully Kafka-like, or something generated by the Kafka instrumentation to add an event to, and have it not be like the your sidekick span. But I don't know, maybe you do want it to be there. I don't know. I guess there's a lot more to think about in terms
of certainly on the consume side. There's another kind of bigger question about some of these events correspond to things that happen during the consumer loop, but outside of the context of processing a message. And we, like in that case, you generally wouldn't have a span, but maybe we want to have a span that is traced separately from the processing of the message. It's a weird kind of thing that has come up for us at Shopify in a different context. So for rescue job workers, the team that is responsible for the background job infrastructure wants to be able to use tracing to do performance analysis of the job worker loop. But those traces should not be associated with the spans that are created for job processing itself, like for an actual job being processed.
Yeah, it's like this idea that me and Francis had a long conversation about. There's like tracing the work that's done from like the application you write, and then there's like the framework kind of busy work that happens in the background that you may not necessarily want to clutter up your back end, like you might like, or your UI, like you might not care about like the 10 million worker loop spans, but you may, like a team might care about it. It's like these kind of like different like areas of interest, right? And so I think some of the stuff for Kafka here probably falls into that, like not knowing what someone would care about, like say like join group, leave group. I don't know what at Cadence that happens, but someone who's in charge of the infrastructure for Kafka at Shopify might care. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I totally get where you're coming from. I know like with rescue in particular, it's like you end up with just like a bajillion like Redis BL pop spans or something, which is like the yeah, it's kind of rescue popping a job off the queue, and you really don't care about this. And in fact, this is something that you probably would want to try to disable. Like if we
Yeah.
suppress spans, I feel like that's a good candidate for suppressing in the rescue instrumentation when and if we write it.
Yeah, that's true. The way we've dealt with that is that we have fairly aggressive head sampling. Like we want to. It happens so frequently that if anything interesting is happening there, then it's going to surface even with heavy sampling. But that's an interesting case where we actually need different sample rates for request spans versus this kind of framework span.
Yeah, like I think we're doing that at like what, like 1/100% or something like that.
Yeah, it's like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 versus like 1 in 5, I think, for our request spans. But we had another case that came up because where our team is trying to do end-to-end tracing of the trace export pipeline. And that's interesting because like by default, we're trying to not trace, like in OpenTelemetry, we're trying to not trace the export call or the export request. But I think it's actually interesting for our team to do performance analysis of the export pipeline using tracing. But it leads to confusion for people who turn on tracing for their brand new service for the first time, and they're not really getting any traffic, but they're generating a whole ton of spans that all say, you know, OTLP exporter.
Yeah. Yeah, I know working for vendors, we really like to turn that stuff off because it confuses customers. But being somebody who's like maintaining the observability pipeline is like that is actually kind of useful information, and I would want to see it, to be honest. So I think that turns up, yeah, this other kind of edge case where like default behavior is probably you don't want to span for that stuff, but there are situations and there are teams who do want that span. So we are probably getting slightly off topic, like in a good way. I think these are all good discussions. But just if you want my opinion on the Kafka instrumentation and what we should focus on, like I know you all are trying to roll this out at Shopify, and like the minimum viable Kafka that is useful to you is likely going to be useful to other people. And if trimming some of these things out that we're less sure about is going to help move that stuff through, and I think it will, like I think it makes sense to do that. So it seems like there's open questions, and things are likely to change there. So it's probably just better for everybody if we remove the controversial parts. It would probably be useful to just kind of create an issue for things that we didn't port over, and just kind of maybe just a quick summary about like what we know about them right now, just so that when we revisit that stuff, we kind of have like a starting point.
Yeah, definitely. And I like it's not like we're making a hard decision of no forever. We're just saying like, no, let's make sure we're doing the right thing and revisit it later and get the MVP in. So like moving to the next part, like I feel like we're in general agreement that we can pull out those events for now and then we can revisit it later. The next part is, so these are the producer and consumer patches. I think the producer is fine the way it is right now. Like, I think that's relatively simple. We're injecting headers, not much else happening there. So the more interesting part now is when we move to consumers, specifically, well, I guess both each message and each batch. Francis and I dug into this quite a bit. And he suggested we make use of links. So we would still generate a span in the same way that we do now. But say in the case of each message, we'd have our loop for processing each message, but we'd also link back to the span that produced it. And then in the case of each batch, we'd have a span for processing that batch loop. And then we would iterate through all the messages in the batch, extract the headers, and if we can, we will link each message back to its producer span. Did I get that right, Francis?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's that at least the examples in the spec for Kafka show, kind of imply that the receiving span is less important and that the primary connection back to the producing spans is via links. So in the case where you process a message at a time, you have a message, so you have a span that may have a parent, but the connection back to the producing span is through a single link. And then in the batch case, you have a span for an entire batch of messages that are being processed. But you have a collection of links to all the producer spans, like one for each message in that batch.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what the semantic conventions are asking for. It does seem like less than ideal to have to iterate through every message in the batch and try to extract.
When you actually look at the work that's done in the Kafka, the Ruby Kafka framework to get to this point, I think iterating over the messages to extract that stuff is remarkably lightweight.
Okay, that actually satisfies all my concerns then. Yeah, like if this is merely like a drop in the bucket of the work that's already going, then that's perfect. Like, I always worry with messaging systems in general because, like, I don't know, Redis, for example, is like crazy fast, and instrumentation, I've noticed, like you feel it. There's just no way around it, and like it's not great. It's like you want observability into your Redis system, but like because it is just so fast, like the small amount of tracing overhead is noticeable. If Kafka is incredibly slow, then we can instrument it all we want.
Cool.
Yeah, Kafka tries to be efficient, at least on the server side of things, by delivering a batch of messages as kind of, here's a chunk of stuff from this offset to this offset. And yeah, your client is responsible for actually breaking that down into individual messages and doing something with it. And yeah, once you actually dig into that work, it's kind of insane.
So it seems like I think we're on the same page for this. So following this discussion, I'll make those changes and I'll ping in some form to flag for review to let you know that I made the change so we can go over it to make sure it makes sense. I have not used links in this library yet, so I'll have to make sure I do it properly. So be extra scrutinous when you review. If we have time, I wouldn't mind jumping to the GraphQL PR quickly, if that's okay.
Sure. Just on the links thing, the key is that you need to create the links ahead of time. So that I don't, from my memory, there's no add link after you've created a span. You actually have to have your entire collection of links and you pass it to the to start span, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a change that came in at some point.
So the PR, I looked at a lot of what Eric had done, and then also because I had recently rewritten our internal instrumentation for GraphQL at Shopify. A lot of applications are using it right now, and like I have quite a bit of confidence in it. So first, I guess let's look at the install, because sorry, not there's going to be a class called the GraphQL_tracer. That's where all the interesting bits are. Yeah, that one. So if you scroll down a little bit, there'll be those three methods, those short ones with the config blocks or the config checks. So I did some tests and like literally just using like Shopify's one when I was rewriting it, and those three keys generate an absurd amount of spans. One of them I had a trace that went from like 11 spans to 2,500 by I think it was the resolve type, or no, it was the field key, the first one there. So that's where you get execute field or execute field lazy. So thinking about what like the right experience we want to provide people who are potentially including this instrumentation is to have these off by default, because it creates like an intense amount of noise if you have a larger GraphQL request. And so like for Shopify, I know we would have it off by default. And that's not to say that there isn't value. I think there's actually a ton of value in the platform field key. But having it on by default, you're just going to produce these obnoxiously long spans. And if you've already got a long span and you do a GraphQL request in there, like I know certain vendors might not be able to display it, and that would just ruin any value you get from this. Does anyone have any like opinions on having this off by default?
I think it makes sense to have it off by default.
So yeah, I was just gonna see like where are these actually used? I could see
So
piping into here and getting you an empty hash.
This is extending GraphQL's platform tracer, so they do actually have like proper tracing support. This isn't doing any weird hacky patching. You can add a tracer to a schema, and they have a trace function that calls, and it'll iterate through all the tracers you've added. And there's different components that needed, so it requires these platform keys. So this is just a way of mapping their internal thing to whatever you want to call it. I took the liberty of going with the GraphQL dot whatever the key was. We can bike chat on that a little bit if it's needed, maybe on the PR, not on the call. And then those three def like platform key, authorized and resolve type. So basically those are different types of field resolution, I guess. I don't know like a ton about GraphQL or how it really does its thing, but basically when it's doing the trace, it'll look to see if it's one of those top keys, and it'll do all the same thing. And then it'll look at if it's authorized, and then it'll be resolve type and execute field. And it checks those three, and those are the noisy ones. Like authorized key will produce a span for, I think, every single field that it hits. Resolve type is, that one I don't know if it's as noisy. I don't know what it looks like in a production environment specifically, but that one is when you have interfaces for a GraphQL object. So it's like I have a automobile, and it could be a car or a truck. If you have an orphan type, when you're resolving that, the resolve type key comes up. I don't know what the value is there, but the one that is noisy and is valuable is the platform field key. So this is when it actually executes a field. And the reason why I say it's valuable is because sometimes with your active record or however you set up your GraphQL, when it's actually doing that work, some of these fields could require calculations. It could be doing something more than just like plucking an attribute out of a model. So it could be doing a lot of heavy work. Like in the example I was doing with one of our internal apps is, I think it was like probably like 98% of the GraphQL request was a single field. But without that key, you don't see that. It just looks like your request took a second, right? Your GraphQL, the execute query took 1 second, but of that 1 second, like 99% of it was just a single field. And then there might have been 50 other fields that took a millisecond, right? So something like, just kind of going off on a quick tangent, like as a future thing is like, I would like to be able to dynamically enable that. So instead of having it just like on boot on or off, I'd like to make it so that someone could enable that if they wanted to trace a specific request and get some more details. But I do think, yeah, long story short, I think it should be off by default.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like these are just kind of like method overrides here for this tracer, and if you return early, that just causes a no-op on the GraphQL side.
Yeah, if you go into the, just a little bit higher there in the code, so on line, oops, sorry, scroll down a little bit. So on line 28 there, so if there's no, so the no-op there, it just returns nil, so then I'm returning the yield. And so we're choosing not to trace.
Cool.
So yeah, line 28, when those come back, if they're not enabled, you get nothing back and it just yields and it doesn't trace those fields. So it's just like a short circuit. The other part that I would like to discuss a little bit, hopefully I have enough time. I think this is interesting, but if it starts turning into like a bike shed, we can just drop it. So right in the yield.tap there, on line 31, I'm doing some weird stuff. And the motivation for that is what I've seen with like previous vendors internally at Shopify. Something that's come up a lot of times, and I've heard from different developers on different teams that are going from like REST to GraphQL, is when you have a request that hits your Rails app and it fails, you see like, oh, my shops controller, whatever, 500. You get the request failed or something like that, or someone sent in some bad information to a post, and you get a lot of visibility. With GraphQL, the complaint that I hear is because it's just a single controller, even if someone makes a bad GraphQL request, assuming it doesn't like actually blow up and it's just like a malformed query, that's a success. Like your requests, like if you're looking at all of your request spans, they're a-okay, like this is looking great. But it could be, you may have done a breaking change in your API, you might have done something, and now all of a sudden all your GraphQL requests are failing, but you have zero visibility into that. So
because everything's a post and everything is a 200.
Yeah. So this was my attempt at making that better. We recently made some changes internally to Shopify, and we're pushing more people onto tracing. And I think this would be a really big win because Shopify uses tracing heavily, and I think this could provide value to like people in general. When you send in like a GraphQL request, and if you try to retrieve a field that's invalid, it hits through this validate action. So if you look on line 32 there, it says like if the keys validate, and I don't even know if using the word response there is the right, it's just whatever is coming back from that tap, and it changes drastically between keys. So if it's validate and there are errors in this object that it returns, I'm setting the span status to have an error, and then I'm adding errors as events. And you can see specifically what field. So if you go to the test for this class, the first test that I did for that class illustrates this. So right there, let me just go a little bit higher. So when the query fails, so I have a schema that defines a few fields. There's like a simple field, a resolved field, and then think I have like the interface something. There's no complex field. So when that goes through, that check will hit. And so the span will come back as GraphQL validate, and I'll start adding errors, and they'll say, okay, what's the name of this event? It's like complex field, and then I add the attributes error message, and it says field complex field does not exist on type query. Now, for me, like, I think this provides a lot of value, because if someone's evaluating if their GraphQL change is working, and all of a sudden there's a ton of errors blowing up, they'll see it now, and they'll actually have information. They'll be able to see it in the trace. My concern is that it's really easy to like make a malformed query in GraphQL, and that could be noisy. So like, I don't know if that's fine or not, like if that's going to create a lot of like unnecessarily alarm bells, because like someone integrating with your GraphQL API doesn't know what they're doing and is like spamming you, and you get tons of errors. I think that's okay. I think those are still errors. Someone's trying to hit your API and it's not working. So I don't know. This could devolve into like crazy bike shedding if there's any GraphQL opinionated people. I'm not. I know Eric mentioned he isn't. But the intention here is like, I think really valuable, and I think this is a good direction to move, but I don't know. It's like, I'm just concerned that I'm missing something that a seasoned GraphQL person would be like, no, you'd never want to do this, or I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Is there any way to look at the response that comes back from a GraphQL request and determine whether or not an error occurred in a reliable fashion, or is it just ad hoc? Like, is error reporting GraphQL ad hoc?
And I have to dig a bit further. While I've been messing around with this, I think it's a little too we're a little too far in that we don't get the structured response. Like, you don't get the actual structured response. Like, I test them in the test here, so I execute the query on line 46 and I get a result back, and then I'm looking at what the user would return. So you can see there, it's like you get a message that says field complex field doesn't exist. So like, this is actually sent back to whoever processed the query or posted the query to like the GraphQL endpoint. So like, the users get this error back, and what I'm trying to do is surface this visibility to like the app owners. But like Francis said, is there like a more structured way to check this? And I kind of feel like this is the way to check it, because we can hook into the key when it's validating the query. Like, this is that validate is this a valid query? Like, to me, it made sense. And I think it is the right place.
Can validation be turned off?
That's a good question. I hope not. Because I think like this is like the internal workings of GraphQL validating whether or not, like, I don't think it's validation in the sense that like, are you allowed to do this, but more so like, can this work?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, like, how will this end up showing as an error? Like, if you had a vendor solution that is producing or extracting SLIs from traces, they're probably extracting them from client and server spans. Is there a way that we can reliably tag or reliably set the error on a server span on this side or a client span for the other side?
I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that right now. And that's why I'm wondering if it might be worth to punt this as its own individual PR, because I think there's a lot more here than just me throwing this in. And I think without this error reporting or whatever we want to call it, this PR I think is valuable in its own without it, because honestly it's just on par with all the vendors right now, which is I'd like to one up, because you can look at yeah, you can look at GraphQL. They actually have support for Datadog, New Relic, Scout, and quite a few other vendors built right into the gem. So I was looking at what they did, and nobody has this type of error reporting. And I know it's just a common complaint I get from peers at Shopify who manage applications with GraphQL APIs. So I would like to do it, but I don't want it to block this PR. To like full transparency, like this GraphQL instrumentation is one of my big blockers for rolling out OpenTelemetry internally at Shopify, because so many applications depend on it. I need it before I can really start making a big push to migrate apps over to this, which is something I desperately want to do. So I don't want to block myself by getting ambitious here.
Yeah, I mean, I will say the same thing that I said about the Kafka stuff. And if this is if this instrumentation is going to work for Shopify, and in whatever version, with or without this error reporting, like I'm totally fine with it. And if you wanted to separate it out, create a separate PR, I think that's totally fine. If you wanted to create an issue to talk about it, that's also fine. But yeah, anything I can do to help you all get this stuff out in production, I'm on board with.
I think just like having talked about it a lot with you two just now, I think I will end up pulling it out of this PR and pushing it into a follow-up PR, just so that can be the only focus of discussion for that pull request. I don't want it to drown out anything else that might be important on this one. So I'll be doing that as a follow-up. And I do believe that this is valuable without it. I know we're doing it internally, and I have gotten good feedback about it already, about people that have used it. Something that I'm learning is GraphQL has a lot of breaking changes between minor releases. So even the way the instrumentation installs as I have it on this pull request doesn't work 2 versions or 2 minor versions back. It only works on the 2 latest. So thank you, Appraisals, for highlighting that to me. I discovered that with one of our internal apps team, the Facebook people. So I don't know. Anyways, that's just an aside. So yeah, I'll pull that out. I have a couple things I want to change. I know that there's some feedback on Eric's original PR about how to actually install the tracers and whether or not we should accept supplied schemas. I think the default of what we're doing, or what we have right now in the PR, what I have in the PR right now, makes sense, but being able to allow users to pass in specific schemas to configure seems fine as well. Yeah. Like as just like a further out thought, like I think it would be a good idea to eventually like try to get a PR for OpenTelemetry just right into the GraphQL gem, because they're already supporting it for a number of vendors, and why not us?
Yeah, I agree with that. As soon as we've got a 1.0 release of the API, we should start pushing some of this instrumentation, this auto instrumentation, into the upstream projects.
Yeah, if they're already doing that for other vendors, I think they would be stoked probably to do it for like an open standard and adopt it. And I think that's gonna be the next frontier, you know, once we have everything stable, is to try to get adoption for, you know, first party instrumentation rather than the stuff that we're writing.
So
Not that it's not excellent stuff.
So do we, because like the install method that I'm using, which as I understand it and what I've read through GraphQL, like we're taking like the root schema and we're saying, use this tracer and we supply a tracer. That's not supported three minor versions ago. And they've deprecated something about global tracers recently that I need to look into, make sure that doesn't apply to what Eric had in his. Are we okay with only saying the last two minor versions of GraphQL are supported? That seems very narrow, but
I guess
that's key.
that's a little narrow, and people will want some wider coverage. Do you have any idea like what the level of work is to?
I don't know yet. I'm gonna look at applying what Eric had for supporting accepting like defined schemas and see if applying tracers using that method supports older versions, and maybe that becomes the alternative. I don't know. There's a lot of churn in the GraphQL code base. People I've talked to internally just like about how they're using GraphQL and what like some of their pain points were, because I wanted to get some perspective going into this. They were just saying that every time they do a minor version bump, like it's breaking changes and it's a pain in the ass. So it's hard to say. Like I'm concerned that maintaining this is going to be a little bit frustrating. And it'll be bad if we have to just do a ton of switches between versions to support even like a few minor versions. Like it's as I have it right now, it's 2, the latest and the one before that.
Yeah, I don't know what to say here. I think if you can just kind of look at like the level of effort to support a few things back, and if it's looking crazy, then I think we should see if we can get away without doing it. If it's one of these things where you can reuse like 90% of the code, and then you just kind of have like some, a few different cases when you install something, then that might be worth it.
I think like the not the problem, but like where maybe it's having some issues is like the assumed way that people use like their supported tracing API is like it's less auto-y and much more explicit. Like when you're defining your schema, you say use this tracer. You can use any number of tracers right in your schema. But what we're doing is we're saying, let's take their ancestor, like the root schema that every schema should be extending from in a GraphQL API, and we're saying like the ancestor uses this, and so then any schemas that extend it now have tracing, which is great for the auto instrumentation perspective, but I don't think that's going to be like a concern or a supported path by the library maintainers, or maybe it is. It doesn't seem that way because of the documentation around using, say like New Relic is like in your schema, drop a line that says use New Relic tracer, right?
I see.
So, but yeah, I will explain, like long-winded, short. Yeah, I'll explore that and see what it looks like, because I'll be doing that for what Eric had anyways to try to support that.
Yeah, and if it looks like a total nightmare, then I think we can maybe appease the masses by saying we really want to try to get this integrated into GraphQL once our tracing API hits 1.0, and that can be like the escape hatch, I guess.
Cool.
Cool. I do need to get going. So I guess just the last thing is these PRs are in progress. You are going to be off for a while. Like, are these things you're trying to get done before break, or are they probably going to be after break things?
Hopefully before. I don't think anyone's gonna yell at me if they're done after, because I'm not gonna be migrating internal apps till after break anyways. Yeah, Francis is gonna scold me after. I'm gonna make the Kafka changes today, and I'm going to make my best effort to get the GraphQL in a state that is ready for review today. So even if I could get a round of reviews before the end of break, that would be cool. So I can come back to it. But
Cool. Yeah, today is my last day working technically, and then I'm on break. But I'll keep an eye on these because I know it's a lot better to go into break knowing that things are, you know, in a pretty final state at least.
yeah. So yeah, if today's your last day, I don't expect to have these all prim and polished, maybe Kafka, but that's fine. It's more
I'm
of
fine
my
to
own
pop
internal
in
tool.
and check things out though.
Okay.
Maybe in a break because break is long enough, you know.
Cool. Thanks for staying over, by the way. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. I thought, you know, it was good to talk through these things. So, yeah, I'll see you all online. Have happy holidays. And
Yep.
Useful.
Enjoy
Take
your
care.
break. Cool.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yep.